Okay, so the focus of today's show is continuous deployment to an Azure Container App. Now we happen to be publishing an ASP.NET Core, the typical out-of-the-box weather forecast, but it doesn't really matter what the underlying technology is because ultimately we're just publishing the container image. So there's a couple of things that I've set up beforehand. There are other shows. Check out the show notes that go into a bit more detail with these steps. But I have created a new repository in GitHub. It's called Action Now. And I've cloned that locally into my Action Now folder. And I've gone into that folder and we are on the master branch. And that currently looks like that. There's a typical source directory there. So just taking a quick look at that, you can see we've got two API projects, API 1 and API 2. All right, so this is the solution which I created beforehand. Very simple API out of the box, like I said, out of the box weather forecast. They're both exactly the same, just one is called API 1 and the other is API 2. Like I said, the main focus is the continuous deployment aspect to a container app. So the details of the APIs we're not so much interested in this show. All right, so the next step is to publish. This is going to create some resources in Azure for us. Now there is a couple of resources I've already created in Azure. I've created a shared resource group, and also in that I've put our shared container registry. It's just quicker and easier to create that, and there's really nothing to it, nothing really to learn that I could show you. All right, so that's some pre-existing stuff. Let's go ahead and publish our first API up to the container app. So just simply, I'm just going to use the Visual Studio tools to do this. There are other ways. So I'm going to publish to Azure, obviously, Azure Container App. Going to wait for that to load. There are no current instances. That's right. So we're going to create a new instance. And we're going to call this Action Now API 1. All right. The resource group, I'm going to create a new one called Action Now Resource Group. And Container Apps environment. These things can take a while to create. I'm going to go ahead and create a new one here. And we're going to call that Action Now Environment, Australia East. And that's the other thing that was created beforehand is the log analytics workspace. So I'm just using that existing default workspace. All right, so that's the container name. Let's go create. That's going to take a little while. Okay, so that's completed. And what it's done for us is created our resource group. Let me just navigate to resource groups. The Action Now resource group, and it's created our environment, the Container Apps environment. There's typically one of those that have multiple container apps running in them. Could just be one. And this is our container app here. And you can see that it's running a revision. Now, the first thing that we want to do here is manage the scale. One of the great things about container apps that I love is it scales down to 0. So that means it's not costing you anything whilst you get distracted and get dragged onto some other project. And drop it to 0 after 10 minutes of no requests, it stops costing you money. So let's just create a new revision now. And you can see that's our new revision is activating. And the only difference in this revision, it's using the same image, which actually is not currently there. The The main difference is this one will scale to 0, whereas this one always ran at 1. That's the default. So make sure you do go in and change that every time you deploy, create a new one. Now, the important thing here is that's just our resources in Azure that we've sorted out so far, that we've created. Still need to complete the publish. In terms of registry, we just want to reuse that one that I have created previously. So we'll just use that one. And we're publishing Docker desktop. Okay, so this is telling us that we need some extra access. No problem, we'll enable that. Okay, and then we are ready to publish, because remember, we've only got the resources there. There's no code running yet. So we click publish, and that will then build our Docker container and ultimately push it to our container app. Okay, so that finished. The container app is ready, and it launched the window over here. So if we just go to our weather forecast URL, we should see some data. So there's our happy weather forecast. Okay, so we've deployed our code to the container app. Now, how do we set up continuous deployment? And after we've set up continuous deployment, how do we set up continuous deployment when there's multiple container apps that we want to deploy, which is frequently going to be the case. All right, so the first things first, let's get our code, which is still not, we still haven't pushed it up to our repository. It's just an empty repository right now. So if we just check our status, if we do a git add, we should now have everything added. We've got our 2 APIs added and the solution file. So let's commit it. And we'll just call that initial commit. And let's push it up to the repository. It's always a good idea to push your code up to the repository as soon as possible, even especially for a new project, because then you can see changes that you've made. Okay, so that's been pushed. That's important for the next step, which is setting up the continuous deployment. So I'm going to have a look at our continuous deployment blade here. Okay, and then we're going to go ahead and pick our GitHub settings, pick the repository, which is action now. We're on the master branch, so that when changes are made to the master branch, that is what will trigger continuous deployment. This is our container registry and the image that we're interested in. And I think for this one, we can go /src/ what was our directory? Here it is down here, action. Oh, no, it's not. So it'll be that folder name. Action now API 1. Now I don't know if we need to put Docker file on the end there. I'm going to, but we'll see what happens. All right, so start the continuous deployment. It says that it's completed. So what's happened? In our repository, we should have a new GitHub action. And if we just come in and have a look, we can see the YAML file that was created by clicking on there. So on the master build, it's going to go ahead and create. And this container apps deploy action is the action that does the build and push. It's interesting because if you have a look, if you try and set up a new action, let me just come here, a new workflow. If you search for that nothing comes up. And if we just look for container, there's a few things that come up, but not an Azure Container App. So that's why it's probably, that's a good idea to set it up like from here initially, from Azure initially. Because yeah, going the other way is just, it's a little bit more manual and much more setup work that you need to do to get it working. All right, so let's take a look at this again. It's now failed, and what we're going to do is dig into why it's failed here. Okay, so let's just dig in and have a look at what this errors we have. So no builder was able to build the provided application source. Okay, it's a little bit generic. If we look a little higher up, even though it's not colored in red, we've got another error here, and that's failed to build invalid app path. That's way more helpful. So that path that we gave it before, source action now, API 1, Docker, it couldn't find anything. So what that did before is it's appended it to this app source path. So let's zoom in again, and we've got source action now and Docker. Okay, the path is actually expecting path to the directory, not the path to the file. If we have a look at the documentation for the Azure Container App action, and link in the show notes to this documentation, and we search for the app source path, absolute path to where the source code is. Okay, so our source code is here inside the source directory. So really what we want to do is make that the app source path. We'll include SRC on the app source path. So let's just minimize this guy. I think we can edit this directly from here. Come down, and we're just going to leave it as source. Okay, that's not quite going to be good enough. But let's just commit those changes and see why. So what we've done is fixed the app source path to SRC. And let's see what new error appears. All right, that's probably finished. So let's go and have a look at the runs. Failed. Let's take a look. See if we can see why it's failed. Just coming down to the bottom. There we go. There's some errors. Again, no builder was able to build the provided application source. A bit vague. So let's come up to the top. Downloading a bunch of stuff. Now we've got an error which is a little bit more useful. Ambiguity in selecting a project to build. Found multiple projects. So this is why I created two APIs, which is going to be fairly common if you're doing container apps. It's found API number 2 and API number 1, and it doesn't know which one we want to build. So we have to tell it. And the way we tell it is to go to the work file, edit it, and then we give it the name of the Docker file. And that's where we can put the extra part of the path which we included originally. All right, so app source path, we're just going to put here Docker file, and then our path, which I'm going to cut and paste. And it's the action now API 1 Docker file, which we can see if we look in our path. Action now API 1 is where our Docker file is. So that should map, and that should enable it to build API number 1. And we'll add on number 2 shortly. Okay, so let's go ahead and commit that. Just before we do, jump in and have a look at the documentation and look for Docker file. And you can see a bunch of information in about it, but I want to go to where it is down here. Relative path without any file prefixes to the Docker file. So always check the documentation just to make sure you're doing the right thing. And then we come back here, we're editing this, we're going to commit that change, which will kick off the new build. Added Docker file path. All right, we'll check back in once that completes. Few runs. Okay. Okay, so that has completed successfully, but not without a couple of fixes, which I had to jump in and do. So I introduced 2 bugs with my manual change before. First one was I called it Docker file to put my path, but it's actually Docker file path. So make sure you use that guy. Docker file path, not Docker file. Also, I did Docker file all lowercase. Make sure that you have your capital D if your file has a capital D, which mine does. So both of those are important, which was particularly funny because I went to the documentation and it even has Docker file path here and I still missed it. But anyway, it's a good example purely for demonstrative purposes. Okay, so we've got a working build here. How did it work and what changed in Azure? So let's just go and take a look at Azure. This is the app, the container app we deployed. What it did is it's created a new enterprise application and has given it contributor access on the resource group. So if we click through there, you can see the enterprise application doesn't really tell you anything of interest. But yeah, if we come back out to say the resource group, we can see on role assignments that yes, we have our contributor and there is our enterprise application. In GitHub, what it's done is we have a look at settings in your repository and secrets and variables for your actions. The details, the connection details, passwords, or anything else that might be necessary will be in the Azure credentials. This registry password and registry username is for the container registry. So when we set it up using, let's just go back into here, the continuous deployment from Azure, it created the enterprise application, gave it contributor access on the resource group, and then added the credentials into GitHub so that GitHub has permission to do the update that you want to do. Okay, so we've got continuous deployment happening for our API number 1. The API works, returning our fancy weather forecast. But we have 2 APIs. So what's the quickest way and easiest way to set up the continuous deployment for the second API? So if we take a look in the resource group here, you'll see that the container app resource does not exist for API number 2. So one question is, do we need to create that before we deploy to it? And I thought the answer was yes, but actually we don't need to create it in advance, and we'll see why once we make the change. All we need to do is change the workflow file, which is here on the right. So we're just going to edit that. This build and push to the container app registry is what we need. So I'm literally just going to cut and paste, and then I'm going to go through and change everywhere it has API 1 to API 2, and I'll fast forward that. Okay, so they're both changed to 2, and I would normally come up with a better name here, but I'm just going to add a 2 at the front. All right, so let's commit those changes and see what happens. So added API 2. And let's go to runs. All right, and then we'll wait. Okay, so that build has completed. That deployment has completed. Build and push to container registry. Let's get down to the bottom of this. Now, no, this is the one we want. Taking a look here. Okay, so this is the reason why we didn't need to create the container app in the first place. The command that it's using is AZ Container App create. Okay, great. So did it create it? Just refresh that resource group. Yes, we've got our second API here. Does it work? So just go there and then we'll type weather forecast. Okay, so it doesn't appear to be loading. So let's see if we can find out why. Everything appears to be normal here. That would be the right URL, I'm sure. Let's take a look at revisions and replicas. And okay, something's processing. Right, so we probably want to wait and see what the detail is. But instead of doing that, let's also take a look at number 1, the comparison. So I'm just going to open that in a new window, bring that over here. All right, so one thing I noticed that was interesting about this is the scale is initially set up as 0 to 10, whereas we set it up as 0 to 1 over here. You probably want to drop that back down. However, the fact that it's on it scales to a minimum of 0 is the main thing that we want. It'll only scale up to 10 if it suddenly gets smashed. Okay, so that's not a difference. It's not going to be a reason why it's not working. Ingress is a good place to look. So let's take a look. What's different here? So everything appears to be the same, except in our API 1, we've got port 8080. So if you remember, in our Docker file, we're exposing port 8080. So by default, when the AZ Container App create is run, it must be using 80 as the default. We weren't asked to specify that, so we can drop that in here now. Click Save, wait for the update to come through, and we'll try our API again, see if it's working. That's probably finished. We can check by coming into revisions. We can see it's running now instead of spinning its wheels. And what about the API over here? It's not going to find anything on the root. So let's go to weather forecast, and yes, we are getting a result back. So super easy to set up the continuous deployment for a second API once you've done the first one, and very nicely, it's reusing the same credentials. So we didn't need a new Azure enterprise application, and we didn't need to set up any new secrets in GitHub. So there we have it. 2 container app APIs running and being continuously deployed to. So if we make a modification to our code now and it's committed onto the master branch, that's going to be automatically deployed to API 1 and API 2. So the focus of today's show was how to quickly and simply deploy a couple of APIs to container apps. Normally, the approach you would want to use to creating the resources, you would want to use some infrastructure as code, and there's lots of different choices there. You can use Pulumi, you can use Bicep, ARM templates, Terraform. There's lots of different choices, so it depends on your team as to which one works best. Personally, I like Pulumi because as a coder, that one makes more sense to me and gives me a lot more power versus messing around in JSON, and trying to put logic in JSON is problematic. Okay, so it was hopefully enough to get your apps, your APIs up and running in a container app. Make sure you remember to scale down to 0 to save yourself some money. And check out the show notes for links to documentation and to other shows that have more relevant and deeper information on various aspects of what you've seen today. Yeah, thanks for watching, and be kind, be curious, and go create something awesome.